Students, welcome back. This is part 2, effects of inflation on the balance of trade. If you have not watched part 1, get out of here. Go watch part 1 and return. And if you have, then let's proceed. Okay? In part 2, we are focused on evaluation points, which basically means that this is our standard analysis, but our standard analysis may not necessarily hold true. For example, because there are certain assumptions that may not hold true. So that's the kind of evaluation that we are doing here. And the first evaluation point involves whether it holds true for an economy like Singapore. That's pretty interesting. You'll find that, a lot of these assumptions that we have made previously may not actually hold for an economy like Singapore. So let's first look at the export side of things. There is a thinking that Singapore's exports may actually have PED value that is less than 1. That the demand for Singapore's exports may be price inelastic. And the justification for that is that a lot of our exports, especially in the recent decade, they are high-tech, high value added. There are very few or if not no close substitutes for. So based on that reasoning, very high-tech, very high value added, okay, very few competitors. So based on that thinking, perhaps PED value may in fact be less than 1. If it is less than 1, then all these analyses will not hold true, and in fact the export revenues would increase rather than fall. Okay, so that part I think I can leave you to work out. So the important thing is that we are questioning if this assumption really holds true for an economy like Singapore. It may not, because of the type of exports that we have been selling. Alright? Now, let's look at the import side. We had to make this assumption that the imports and domestically produced goods and services are substitute. Is that true for the case of Singapore? Generally, that's not true. Because a lot of what we import are actually goods that we do not even produce, right? Going forward, maybe we'll be producing some cars, electric cars, okay? But still, by and large, a large proportion of our imports are not what we produce. And therefore, this assumption generally would not hold true. If that's the case, then all these analyses also not true. So in fact, if this is not true, and export revenues here increase, then we may find that inflation might actually lead to an improvement in the trade balance. Okay? Now, although we may say all that, at the same time, let me also share with you what my judgment would be in this case. Okay, so let's not get too carried away. I would say generally PEDX less than 1 is quite hard to believe. Even though we produce, maybe our diapers are very unique because very high tech, because can self-test for COVID-19. Maybe we got some technology, the diaper turns black, then I'm sorry, your infant kena COVID-19, better rush to the hospital. Okay, but even then, conceivably, there will be some competitors out there in the world, right? So even though high-tech, high value added, but it's not likely to be so unique that there are no or hardly any competitors out there in the world. So I would say PEDX less than 1 is a very, very unlikely scenario. Okay? So most likely it is still more than 1, just that it could be 1.1, 1.2 on the low side instead of 1.8, 1.9, etc. on the high side. Okay? So what I'm saying is that my judgment is that this will still happen, but it will not be significant. That means there will still be a fall in export revenue, but it will not be that significant because the PE value more than 1, but on the low side. Clear? And on the import side, I would also say, well, generally, yeah, a large proportion of what we import are stuff that we don't produce, but there are still goods and services that we import which we have domestic substitutes for. And already here we have got one example, right? So I would say that this would still happen. Okay, but again, it's going to happen to a small extent, right? So if you follow my reasoning, then I would say in the case of Singapore, most likely inflation is still going to bring about a worsening of the trade balance, just that it is not going to be that significant compared to in other cases, compared to other countries. Okay? So we do the evaluation point, we question whether these assumptions necessarily hold. We give an example of Singapore where it may not hold, but I also want to share with you my judgment on the matter. Okay, so that if you do need to make a judgment on that, okay, you can follow my recommendation. Clear? Now we proceed to the next evaluation point, right here. Relatively lower inflation rates. So what are we talking about here? Yeah, there's inflation. Yeah, there's inflation, right? But only inflation in this economy, man. Other countries don't have inflation. Most likely, there's inflation in most parts of the world, right? So it is not just this economy that is facing inflation. Other countries most likely face inflation as well. So the question is, what if, yeah, we have inflation, but what if our inflation rates are still relatively lower than those experienced elsewhere? Relatively lower inflation rates. Does that change the analysis? And the answer is yes. It will change the analysis. Okay? Because if we have relatively lower inflation rates, we have inflation, but it is relatively lower, then lo and behold, our exports are now more price competitive despite our inflation, right? And imports are now less price competitive despite our inflation because foreign price levels are increasing as well, and increasing at a faster rate. So already you can see that it is a very different starting point compared to earlier, right? Earlier we say, oh, our exports are more expensive. So in fact, here it looks like we are less price competitive, right? And over here, the imports are now more price competitive. But if you have a relatively lower inflation rates, then right at the beginning, the whole picture is different. Okay? So from here, how do we analyze? So let's zoom into what happens when foreign prices increase. What happens when foreign prices, or if you like, foreign price levels increase? So when foreign price levels increase, you will find that where our exports are concerned, demand will increase. Why? This is the effect from price of related goods. And here we are making the assumption that they are substitutes, okay, which is a fairly reasonable assumption to make, right? So if foreign price levels are increasing, demand for exports, which we assume are substitutes to those foreign goods, the demand would be increasing. Price of related goods, price of substitute goods, demand factor. So this will bring about a rise in export revenue. All clear? Now, over here, price of imports are increasing, right? Because the foreign prices are increasing, right? So the import prices will also be increasing, okay? So this is very different from earlier, right? Earlier, price of imports, no change, right? That's in the original scenario. Here, price of imports are increasing. Assuming PDM more than one, same assumption as earlier, i.e. there are domestic substitutes available, then this will happen and import expenditure will fall. So when foreign prices are increasing, which means there is inflation elsewhere, there's foreign inflation, then we have reached the conclusion of export revenues increasing, import expenditure falling. And obviously this is the opposite of what we had done earlier when inflation was occurring domestically, right? But because the foreign inflation rates are higher, these should outweigh the above effects. What does that mean? That means this should be greater than the fall in export revenue arising from the domestic inflation. And over here, the fall in import expenditure should outweigh this rise in import expenditure occurring from domestic inflation. Therefore, with relatively lower inflation rates, we have inflation, but it is relatively lower, balance of trade should be improving instead. So hence, this is another evaluation point, because basically what we are saying is that, okay, yeah, inflation, okay, balance of trade worsens, but is it always like that or not? So the answer is no, because you also need to consider what about inflation in other countries. So if there's also inflation in other countries and our inflation rates are relatively lower, then in fact the balance of trade should not worsen. What? It should improve instead. Got it? So that is the second evaluation point that I would like to share with you. Alright? So I hope this clarifies, strengthens your understanding, your analysis, and if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me and let me know. And if you have any requests for further concepts to be explained, let me know as well. See you sometime soon. Ciao.